Good morning, everyone. I'm Gönül Tol. I'm a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. There's a lot happening right now with protests continuing in Iran and growing speculation about possible US military action. So much of the focus is understandably on the Middle East, but today we are shifting the focus to another crisis that has huge regional and global implications, the war in Ukraine. Next week, in Davos, Ukraine's G7 partners are set to meet with President Trump, hoping to secure his personal backing for security guarantees tied to a potential post-ceasefire plan. And that puts Turkey in a particularly interesting and complicated position. Uh, where does Ankara stand on these talks? What would a prolonged Russia-Ukraine war mean for Turkey's security? And can Turkey really keep balancing between Washington, Moscow, and Kiev? So to help us think through these questions, I'm joined by a great panel. Andrew Weiss is a Vice President for Studies and the James Family Chair at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Philip Gordon is the Sidney Stein Junior Scholar at Brookings, and Evren Balta is a Professor of Comparative Politics and International Relations at Özyeğin University in Istanbul. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. One quick housekeeping note before we dive in. If you're watching and would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A box on your screen and I'll try to bring your questions into the discussion as we go. Phil, let me start with you. President Trump is heading to Davos next week, and European leaders are expected to meet with both Trump and President Zelensky there. Yesterday, the US accused Russia of escalating the war. And I remember that discussion in Washington. Trump's original 20-point peace plan was widely seen as tilting toward Russia, with Ukraine asked to make territorial concessions. But recent signals from the administration suggest the mood is shifting. Trump appears increasingly frustrated with Putin, and the pendulum may now be swinging in Zelensky's favor. So against that backdrop, and after the Paris talks last week, where Trump envoy Witkoff and Jared Kushner signed on to a 5-point plan, are the Americans, Europeans, and Ukrainians finally aligned?
Thank you, Gönül, and thanks everyone for joining. Good morning. I was smiling, Gönül, as you were saying that, because I have been hearing people talking about the administration's position shifting, essentially for the entire year, since Trump, started off the administration swearing he was going to bring this conflict to an end, but doing so while seeming to embrace Russian positions. And every few, weeks, if not less, we hear talk that he's finally reached the end of his tether. He's fed up with Putin and he's going to shift. So on that, I will believe it when I see it. It is true there have been moments where it did seem the United States was getting fed up and putting the onus on Russia, including, as you say, just this week. But we've heard talk of that so many times. If you remember, right before the Anchorage summit, Trump made clear that there would be severe consequences if Putin didn't go along and accept a ceasefire. And then somehow afterwards, we were right back to where we were before, with Trump blaming Zelensky for the war and not willing to provide material support for Ukraine. It is also true, and there have been a few cases of consequences, including, most importantly, I think, the sanctions on the big Russian oil firms. That said, the administration has been much more consistent in its refusal to impose serious consequences on Russia. And like I said, that I will believe when I see. It's also fair to say, and you hinted at this, that in recent weeks, the administration has aligned itself a bit more closely with Ukrainian and European positions, but that's only in comparison to where it started with this absurd 28-point plan, which seemed to have been drafted in Russia, possibly because it was. Uh, Once there was such a bad reaction to that plan in both Ukraine and Europe, the administration did move, and I think over the past weeks has been quite constructive in coming up with a potentially more acceptable plan for Ukraine, potentially because there's still really difficult territorial compromises that would have to be made in exchange in part for security guarantees that will have to be fleshed out. So that's good, but I'll just end with the thought that that's only part of the problem. To have a ceasefire or peace, you need Russia too, and there's
Yeah.
very little sign that Russia is willing to accept whatever the United States and Ukraine have come up with.
Yes, you spoke about the security guarantees, and I know you wrote this excellent piece for the New York Times, um, basically saying that it doesn't mean anything. I want to come back to that, but before that, as a follow-up, um, as I mentioned, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner signed on to a five-point plan with European leaders on Tuesday last week to enhance these guarantees for Ukraine if if it reaches terms to end the invasion. But it's not clear to me what that means. So can you, I mean, who is providing what? What security guarantees are we talking about? So can you break down what we actually know coming out of Paris last week?
It's a good question because I think that is the essential question that Ukraine needs an answer to before they would ever feel comfortable doing this, difficult territorial compromise. And the U.S. has simply said, I mean, there was the only formal thing that has come out, interestingly, is that the European Commission put out a statement on this, whereas the U.S. has just been, backgrounding the press and didn't even sign on to the joint statement that the Europeans did. And that statement, I think, I would say worryingly, at least from a Ukrainian position, just said, I think it had the words, with the proposed support of the United States. Oh, I see, with the proposed support of the United States. And then when Trump was asked about it last week, he told the New York Times he would only have signed on to any security guarantee if he was confident that Russia would not invade and that the Europeans will be in the lead. So what it seems to be is that they've been calling it NATO-like security guarantees, but they're not really NATO-like because NATO is a treaty, NATO is an organization with integrated military forces, and NATO has come to be interpreted to mean that the United States would go to war to defend the country. And none of that applies to what's being talked about for Ukraine. What seems to be talked about for Ukraine is that there would be a verbal commitment to come to Ukraine's defense in a manner TBD that could include military support, but might not. That would be bolstered potentially by European presence on the ground in Ukraine, which is quite significant. But then there would be a quote unquote US backstop or commitment to help it. And that's what I have been skeptical about. Donald Trump's track record for standing by such commitments is imperfect. He is not even willing to be clear that the NATO Article 5 treaty guarantee would be backed up. He says that's only valid if allies pay their bills. And, if you just think about it, if the United States isn't even willing to confront Russia indirectly while it's in the process of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, are you really confident it would do anything close to that with some violation of a ceasefire? So we haven't seen exactly the commitments that the United States and Europeans would make. The last language that was put out about this talked about US coming to support Ukraine in one way or another if there was a substantial, deliberate, and sustained Russian attack on Ukraine, which seems to open a pretty big window for Trump to say, well, it's not necessarily sustained or substantial, or they didn't mean it, just like he said when Russia sent drones into Poland. So that's why I've been quite skeptical about this notion that this all works because the US is committed to Ukraine's defense.
Yeah, I think what was more clear, at least from the tone of European leaders, particularly Macron, was that Europe is preparing to step up in a much bigger way, and they will have to iron out the differences and secure that commitment from Trump next week. Andrew, let me turn to you. So far, these talks with Ukraine and the coalition of the willing haven't included Russia at the table. And of course, it's still unclear how much, if any, of what's being discussed, Moscow would actually accept. I mean, the Kremlin has already drawn a red line, saying, because I think in the draft there are Europeans are committing troop deployment inside Ukraine, and the Kremlin says that's a red line. It would and also says that it would reject any changes to Trump's original peace proposal from last fall. And it has Putin has since hardened his position further, accusing Ukraine last month of targeting one of Putin's residences. So my question to you is, what would it take for Putin to sign onto the Paris plan, or even to agree to a ceasefire, given that everything Ukraine's allies are offering depends on the fighting actually stopping first?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and it's nice to be with all of you, including Phil, especially. You know, we've seen not a lot of change in Russia's position as we reach the 4-year anniversary of the war. And right now, the administration has been operating with the theory of the case that this is a war about territory. And the Russians have essentially instrumentalized their conversations with the Trump representatives, especially Ambassador Witkoff, to force Ukraine into surrendering territory. And that's what the Russians, essentially are saying, if you can deliver that, we're prepared to talk about other stuff. And the administration has taken the Russians at their word that this is, a war that if, you simply draw lines on a map somewhere, it can be brought to an end. And I'm sure Phil would have been very happy if that had been the case during the time he was in government, if there was some easy solution to this war. And I really think that's magical thinking. We know from hard experience that Putin is looking for fundamental changes in what the nature of Ukraine would be in the form of some deal. And it would involve removing Ukraine's sovereignty and neutralizing Ukraine's ability to defend itself in the future by putting very strict limits on the size of Ukraine's military, the kinds of military equipment, and other relationships it could have with Western powers. So that's still all part of the Russian position, but I think they're using the territory issue as the wedge and using the Trump administration as the battering ram to try to wear down the Ukrainians. Russia is also, not uh, relenting on the military side as all of these conversations unfold. And we know from their strategy during the Syrian civil war that they are perfectly capable of having two tracks. So they're allowing the United States to keep talking and trying to put pressure on the Ukrainians using the United States as their cudgel. But in the meantime, they're trying to break Ukraine's back. And we have really strong attacks, particularly right now, going into the winter season on Ukraine's energy system. And, they're expecting that at some point the Ukrainians are simply just not going to have the ability to resist. And they'll, this strategy of grinding them down eventually will pay off. I don't think they're right about that, but that is the goal. And so everything else to me feels like details or abstraction. And we're sort of denying the reality here, which is Russia doesn't want an independent Ukraine. And it's not entirely clear to me that the Trump administration, as Phil was just outlining, is going to be making the kind of sweeping commitments to maintaining Ukraine's independence and future security down the road that prevents Russia from, essentially pursuing a aggressive policy towards Ukraine without end.
I mean, again, it's very confusing to me because having listened to the European leaders last week, I mean, they sounded like they had sorted out with Witkoff's support the sticking points. One thing that they raised was obviously that remained unresolved was the territorial angle, including Zelensky's recent proposal for both Ukrainian and Russian forces to withdraw from front lines in order to establish a demilitarized zone. This was an alternative to agreeing to Putin's demand that Ukraine cede the north of Donetsk province And Witkoff said that, I mean, yes, that's one thing. Resolving land disputes is a sticking point, but everything else is fine. But you're saying, again, going back to the draft, they seem to agree that, we will keep Ukraine's army at 800,000 troops. Western powers will provide funding and then membership in the European Union, the European military support and all that. But Andrew, you're saying that forget the territorial dispute. Putin will not even be okay with those other things, including EU membership.
So it depends on which specific issue, Gunnar, you
Mm.
want to take, but let's just go to the one Phil mentioned, which is the idea of a Western military presence in Ukraine as some form of a tripwire. The Russians, for the longest time, have been saying that is a total non-starter for them. And we've ended up in a situation where some form of Russian consent is now being accepted as a determinant of whether there will be Western forces inside Ukraine. We're giving Russia a veto effectively. Second is the question of what the size of Ukraine's military is. The Russians have been very specific in the past that that's a key issue for them. And there's no sign that they are changing their position. And across the board, we've seen very little, if any, change in Russia's overall position. And then lastly is the question of sort of ongoing Western security assistance for Ukraine, which is absolutely critical for Ukraine's capacity for self-defense. The Russians have been saying that all has to end and that that's a threat. It's part of the root causes of the war that the West is, cooperating with this post-Soviet country that Russia doesn't accept. That it's even a legitimate independent state. So it requires huge leaps of faith to assume that something fundamental has changed in the Russian position. I think there have been changes in the US position, and we've seen discussions about some kind of security arrangement that would, be put in place. As Phil said, there's a lot of skepticism about whether any commitment from the Trump administration is credible, but I do think that the US position has evolved on that, and there's been a lot of detailed discussion about what kind of long-term security arrangements for Ukraine are absolutely required to avoid a third phase of this war breaking out down the road. But getting to that point where you have Russian buy-in for the outlines of this kind of peace deal, to me, just feels extremely far-fetched, given what's happening on the battlefield.
Before I turn to Evren, one last question, Andrew. You said that U.S. position has slightly changed. Is that I remember the administration talking about this 50-year guarantee, right? And on paper, that sounds like a long time, but in reality, it's not. I mean, is that what you were referring to when you talked about how the administration's policies shifted?
I'm talking about something broader, which is that, there's been this intensive discussion about security arrangements for Ukraine. And the administration has gone from saying, no, never, we're not interested, to let's talk about that and let's map out what the package would involve. And it has several elements. Part of it is the European deployment, part of it is the creation of a very big package of security, long-term security and military cooperation with Ukraine, continued provision of important weapons that Ukraine needs for its defense, continued provision of important intelligence information, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of dimensions to this. And the administration has gone from saying we're not interested to let's map this out and let's really put it together. I'm not persuaded Donald Trump has bought into any of this for the reasons Phil has outlined very persuasively, but the people underneath him at the Pentagon, the State Department, and including in Trump's own entourage with Jared Kushner's involvement and Steve Witkoff's involvement, are looking at these issues. But everything hinges on the whims of Donald Trump. And as we all know, he has been steadfast in the idea that there's got to be a new U.S.-Russia relationship, that the U.S. and Russia, can cooperate. And, to my mind, that, just diagnoses Russia's motivations exactly wrong. Like, Russia is not a friend of the United States. Its goals in Ukraine are not benign. And the sort of dangling of commercial cooperation that both the United States and Russia have been engaging in this kind of big talk about cooperating in the Arctic, cooperating on rare earths, all this stuff to me just seems very ungrounded from reality.
Evren, let me bring Turkey into this. We know Erdogan is walking a very fine line here. The war has put real pressure on Turkey's security, especially in the Black Sea. But at the same time, Erdogan has a complicated relationship with Putin. He also wants to keep his channels open with Trump and is looking to deepen defense ties with Europe. And all while Turkey remains one of the biggest buyers of Russian energy, right? So let me ask you this. Where does Turkey stand on Europe's plans to deploy troops in Ukraine? I mean, if that ever happens, and on Trump's earlier push for Ukraine to make territorial concessions.
Okay, thanks, Gunnar, and thanks for having me. Maybe I should start with our general principle, or where in general Turkey has been standing with regard to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And this hasn't changed, as Andrew was saying, that the Russian position hasn't changed. Similar to that, the Turkish position hasn't changed since the beginning of the war. And this is Turkey is basically pro-Ukraine in this case, and supporting the territorial integrity of Ukraine in principle as well. And the government has always been underlining the case that, okay, we are in favor of territorial integrity of Ukraine, and that's for two reasons, basically. One is the principle. The main principle of Turkish foreign policy has always been the idea of territorial integrity, and the second is the balance of power in the Black Sea. Turkey doesn't want to be a really strong Russia that controls the coastal areas of Ukraine and this and that. So this is the first line, I guess. I mean, being pro-Ukraine, basically aligning your foreign policy with the NATO, being a member of NATO. But that fine line is also, I mean, I have to underline this element of that fine line, is that Turkey tried to be not seen as anti-Russian, right? So being pro-Ukraine, but at the same time, not being anti-Russian. So specifically in terms of what we talked about, what's going on, these negotiations between the US and the EU, what is the Turkish position over that in the last couple of months? Turkey attended some of these meetings. Hakan Fidan was in Paris, I guess 2 weeks ago. And in that sense as well, the Turkish position basically around this idea of avoiding any sort of commitments before there is a ceasefire that Russia also agrees. And it also underlined, the Turkish position kept underlining that this is building a framework, what happens after a ceasefire, and we are not committing anything before a ceasefire. So the ceasefire, before a ceasefire, there's not going to be any kind of Turkey basically express its intention for troop deployment if there is a ceasefire, if there is a defined mandate, if there is a legal basis, if there are some exit conditions, if there is an agreement between EU, US, and also Russia and Ukraine, if there is a major or a grand coalition or a grand consensus, which is, as we were discussing, as Phil was discussing, it seems to be hard to achieve right now. So I think that's the general position. So Turkey wants to be involved in Black Sea security, sees itself as an important partner in that, wants to be involved or becoming a major partner in redefined European security, wants to be part of reconstruction process that's also tied to the security guarantees, but there are some preconditions for that.
But I think up until last year, maybe summer of 2025, Turkey was interested in deploying troops if it was framed as this international coalition. That's not the case anymore, is it?
I think there is less interest right now. I mean, Turkey was more interested last year because there was less of a ceasefire talk, less of security guarantees. And as all these things are becoming more of a topic and becoming more realizable, that Turkey seems to be more wary of the consequences. And maybe we should add to this the suspicions of not just Turkey, but all the allies, what is going to happen to NATO, right? Turkey is a neighbor to Russia, and we know that we have been talking about SWIMPs and all these, conflicts with the European leaders and Trump's unwillingness to contribute to the European security. Turkey is now more how to say, suspicious, let me say, that NATO is going to be providing security if Russia becomes more aggressive. So there really is the case of this general case of or the general problems that's going on in terms of global security, and the future of NATO is affecting Turkey's position, I think.
Hakan Fidan, after meetings in Paris, he said that that Turkey is interested in taking on a naval role in the Black Sea security as part of these guarantees for Ukraine. Wouldn't taking the lead, I mean, I know they haven't framed this as a NATO mission, right? Instead, it's called the Coalition of the Willing, but yet, if there is going to be a naval force, Turkey, certainly, if it takes the lead, there are other countries, regional countries that are a member of NATO. So I feel like that taking the lead on a Black Sea naval mission would be a very risky move for Ankara, especially given the recent incidents involving Russian-made drones in Turkish airspace, and something, by the way, the opposition sees as Russia sending a warning shot to Turkey. So what's your take on that?
I mean, there is this fine line that you were mentioning between US and Russia that Turkey is basically walking is similar here. We have been talking about regional ownership when it comes to Black Sea security. If you remember, like maybe before the war, 10 years ago, the regional ownership, regional ownership of the Black Sea. And that was Turkey's official position. And that idea meant that the outside naval forces should not be hegemonic or should not be present in the Black Sea. Only littoral states should have naval forces or naval presence in the Black Sea. So after the war, this idea of regional ownership is not there anymore, but I think there's a revised regional ownership position. So the idea is that NATO littoral states, Black Sea states, should be basically providing security in the Black Sea, not the US, not the other European powers. So this is basically in line with that position. Turkey doesn't want outside actors to be present in the Black Sea. And in order to be able to defend that, you have to lead it, right? And as you were saying, there are already some efforts, for example, for demining cooperation efforts that the Turkey is also part of. And Turkey wants, in that sense, to keep the Montreux Bay's balance intact. And its hegemonic role in the Black Sea in terms of access points and this and that intact, and avoiding a permanent extra-regional naval actor to be present in the Black Sea. I think that's the position. And as you were saying, that's a risky position because it puts Turkey, and also in conflict with, I was saying, it puts Turkey in conflict. It may put Turkey in conflict with the Russian interests in the Black Sea as well.
Andrew, it would be nice if you could weigh in on this, and I have another question for you. I mean, traditionally, there have been spheres of influence in the Black Sea, right? Russia has control over the north and Turkey in the south. So this Black Sea naval mission, how would Putin perceive that, led by Turkey? And my second question is, Senator Lindsey Graham said he met with Trump at the White House earlier Wednesday, during which he says the president greenlit the Russia sanctions bill that has been in the works for months. And this bill allows the administration to impose tariffs and secondary sanctions on countries that purchase Russia's oil, gas, and there's other uranium and other exports. So my second question to you is, while sanctions have clearly slashed the profits Russia makes from exporting oil and gas, The question is whether the financial pain has actually changed Russian behavior or the trajectory of the war. So the real issue is, can sanctions work this time?
No, good questions, Kunal. Let's take them in sort of reverse order. Sanctions are a tool, but not an end in themselves. And from the very beginning, Russia has been subjected to unprecedented levels of economic coercion that the Biden administration and European allies and G7 partners put together. So Russia has dealt with that problem. There's a new equilibrium that emerged. And because Russia is a petrostate that doesn't have significant amounts of external debt, it's been able to find its way and find workarounds and essentially finance the war. And, we've had a problem where any of the major tools that we could have used would have imposed serious costs on our own prosperity. And President Biden and now President Trump certainly did not want to harm, U.S. Economic prospects to prove a point about our anger about Russia's aggression against Ukraine, that would reduce our capacity to be influential on the world stage. It would hurt our own economic vitality. So I think that there's just a limit to the way, we can impose, say, a sweeping oil embargo or, some of these steps that people have talked about that would end up, hurting the United States as much as they would hurt Russia. So they weren't on the table. I don't see anything in the recent signals from the administration that suggests they've had a change of heart. It's all about let's put psychological pressure on Putin, let's threaten, let's cajole. Donald Trump's more frustrated, more impatient. But this is all in the context of head games with the Russian regime, which knows what it wants and has been bloody-minded in pursuing it. And the Trump administration has been sort of all over the map, trying to find a policy in the dark, sort of fumbling around. So to me, I would just kind of set that aside. There's a new piece of legislation, which I think came Phil can correct me here, out of the Senate Banking Committee, which is a much more serious package than the sanctions package that Lindsey Graham has been touting for, the better part of a year. The version that's in the Senate is much more sort of about creating escrow accounts where Russian sales of oil would, generate profits that have to be put into escrow that would then be used down the road to support Ukraine. I don't know if this administration would ever, countenance such a sweeping package. But again, those are the kinds of steps that would need to be considered if you wanted to really use sanctions in an effective and innovative fashion going forward. On the Black Sea patrols, it's not that different from what I was saying about the idea of a European force being deployed inside Ukraine. I have a lot of trouble believing the Russians are going to live with any of the sort of elements that are being discussed: a ground force, a maritime mission, possible air patrols by NATO aircraft over Ukraine to ensure that the ceasefire is being implemented by both sides. To me, all of these things just sort of fly in the face of what we know about Russia's views of what it wants, which is a Ukraine that can't defend itself and where Russia has free reign. Over.
Andrew, there's a question. I think you're the best place to answer this. The question is, has Russia been able to replace the naval forces it has lost in the Black Sea?
I think that the loss of Russia's freedom of maneuver in the western part of the Black Sea is one of the great signature accomplishments of Ukraine's efforts to defend itself. Ukraine doesn't have a navy, and yet they have now forced the Russians away from Crimea and been, forced to relocate the bulk of their Black Sea fleet to Novorossiysk and to parts of the eastern Black Sea. So that is the sort of long-term formula here for success. Russia can't, with a magic wand, rebuild its navy. Those are long-term investments. There are trade-offs involved in, funding short-term priorities like the ongoing war in Ukraine and long-term things like building Russia's nuclear forces and building its navy. Russia doesn't have infinite resources, and we should be trying to force those kinds of trade-offs on them. But more importantly, it should be the core goal of Western support for Ukraine to help them, use these kinds of tactics against Russia and other domains. So, the Ukrainians were, as I said, very successful using innovative intelligence, sort of weapon, sort of building the drone force and utilizing the intelligence information supplied by Western partners, including the United States, to punish Russia's navy and the naval activities in the Black Sea. We should be using those kinds of theories of support to push Russia's logistics and ability to sustain itself along the line of contact, and make it very costly for Russia to continue to try to grind Ukrainian forces down on the ground. Similarly, the other big challenge is trying to find ways to prevent Russia from conducting these punishing attacks on Ukrainian cities and critical infrastructure. A big part of the problem here is the Western lack of sustainment capability. And it's great that the Trump administration wants a new, larger defense budget, but it's really just a horrible commentary on the state of the U.S. defense industrial base that we are only producing about 500 to 600 interceptors for the Patriot missile system, which is absolutely critical for that effort to protect Ukraine's cities and energy system. So there's a lot of changes that need to be made to ramp up Western support for Ukraine. Unfortunately, we haven't seen the Trump administration doing that. They've essentially tried to say, "Oh, we take money from from Europeans, and then it's sort of up to the Europeans to figure out how to use that stuff and help Ukraine." We've really taken ourselves out of the leadership role that the Biden administration was playing for the first 3 years of this war. And I think, again, it just gets to the strategic myopia of this administration and how it's trying to kind of be hands off at a time when it's really up to the United States to lead this effort overall. Thanks.
Phil, I want to ask you what you think about the sanctions that Senator Graham is talking about. Do you think U.S. will finally move forward with them? That's number one. And the second thing, I want to pick on what Andrew just said about the Black Sea. Obviously, the Black Sea is really key to this conflict. And Russia is trying to cut off Ukraine from having access to the Black Sea, and that will deal a significant blow to Ukraine. The European Union came up with this Black Sea strategy, and I doubt this administration has anything creative in mind when it comes to the Black Sea. But maybe going back to the Biden years, was there any thinking, was there pressure on Turkey, for example, for a larger NATO role, or was there creative thinking in the administration when it came to the Black Sea?
Okay, so first, sanctions and Graham. I guess on that I would put it in the same category I evoked earlier about I'll believe it when I see it. So yes, Lindsey Graham says this week he got the president's green light to move on a sanctions bill that he has told us for many months had vast majority support and was going to move forward. So I actually don't believe it. But, okay, so in theory, he has the president's green light, but then we immediately hear that the plan is actually to let it start in the House because it's a budgetary measure and that it has tariffs in it. So House Democrats are unlikely to support. So there's going to be a lot of back and forth on possibly having to have a similar bill in the House and the Senate. And then even if somehow it's true that Trump gave a green light and it gets through both houses of Congress, as you rightly pointed out, Gonul, it says the president may impose these sanctions if he determines one of a set of things, which he may choose not to determine for that specific purpose. Because then if that bill was actually law and he did, he would have to put 500% tariffs on countries importing oil from Russia, and we're talking about China. So in a world in which Donald Trump is very much focused on his upcoming visit to China, he just essentially backed down to the Chinese. And the last time he tried to ramp up sanctions and tariffs on China, you'd have to believe that he was willing to, in order to put this additional pressure on Russia, have this massive confrontation with China, which would undermine the summit he wants to have and the trade deal he wants to have. So again, anything's possible. Maybe he'll ultimately run out of patience and be willing to do this, but nothing we've seen, in the past 8 or 12 months really suggests that Donald Trump is willing to go to the mat. Which, and I'll get to the Black Sea, but which leads me to reinforce another point Andrew made about what the Trump administration hasn't been doing. I think it gets overlooked in this talk of, is Trump losing patience and might he do something to put pressure on Russia, that he has essentially stopped US support for Ukraine. Yeah. In the Biden administration, we were giving Ukraine tens of billions of dollars of military assistance, of financial assistance, transferring stocks of existing weapons in order to keep their effort alive. And Trump has essentially cut that off, and boasted about it. It's not a secret or an allegation. That's what his policy is. Sure, he's willing to sell what the Europeans can come up with the money to buy, but that is a fundamental change in the approach, which I think only reinforces the Putin view that I think Andrew rightly described, which is that I can wait this out. The Americans are signaling they don't care nearly as much as I do. And I'd like to get what I want in a negotiation, but if I can't get it that way, I'm quite happy to take it militarily. Maybe we'll come back to some of that. On the Black Sea, obviously it was a focus in the previous administration, not least the ability to get Russian grain exports out, which was essential to keep the Ukrainian economy going, but also for world food prices in the early days. And we managed to get short-term fixes like the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and then Ukrainians, through their own cleverness, managed to come up with a route that they could protect to get grain exports out. But those were all patches, and I don't think we ever had a formula, nor was NATO ready to do something much more significant and confrontational vis-a-vis Russia. In the end, that's one of the many, we've all been talking about the many things that would have to be sorted out for this to be sustainable, and an arrangement in the Black Sea will surely be one. I didn't see Foreign Minister Fadan's statement about a Turkish lead role, but I think the way you talked about it, you and Evren talked about it, was right. Of course, Turkey can play a major role, but I don't see Turkey confronting Russia or doing this in the context of a Ukraine peace.
I have one more question for you, Phil, but before that, it sometimes seems as if the Trump administration wants Ukraine to lose this war so that it can be done with it. And that's why I've always found Turkey's position confusing at times. But let me ask you this about the sanctions. We talked about potential sanctions. Turkey is one of Russia's biggest oil customers, and you have India and you have China. We are already seeing Turkish refiners cut back on Russian crude as Western sanctions tighten, and they look for alternatives. But if the Trump administration, let's assume, pushes ahead with tougher sanctions, and obviously that's a big if, given Erdogan's close ties to Trump, would Turkey get a waiver? I think that's what they were hoping for. I remember shortly after Erdogan's visit to the White House, that in the Oval Office, Trump talked about Russian gas too. And later in an interview, he talked about how Hungary would get a waiver. And I think that really raised hopes. But the difference is Hungary gets its gas through pipelines from Russia. It's an infrastructure. You can't do anything about that. Whereas Turkey gets it via ships, the oil. So what is your sense? Do you think, Trump would make an exception to Turkey if sanctions are implemented?
So I want to say something also about your other comment about whether Trump wants Ukraine to use the war. But on that specific question, I don't think Turkey can count on it. Maybe, and it will depend on a lot of other things that are going on in the US-Turkey relationship that I suspect we'll talk about shortly. But keep in mind, Trump also had a good relationship, very good personal relationship with Modi in India. And then he decided to make purchases of Russian oil, at least the ostensible reason for a confrontation and tariffs. Now, some suspect that the real reason was that Modi didn't support him for a Nobel Prize. So maybe the fix for Turkey would be to, keep buying Russian oil and support Trump for a Nobel Prize. And that, I'm like joking, but only half joking, because this will depend on a lot of other factors that are going on. But I guess my bottom line is I don't think Turkey can count on that, because if Trump really is looking for a way to turn up the pressure, then he would, like, it has to come from somewhere. And he was willing to confront India over this. So that would just be part of this multifaceted bargaining that's going on between the US and Turkey on a number of issues. I was just going to say briefly, because and I don't know how facetious you were being when you brought up the idea of whether Trump wants Ukraine to lose the war. I don't know that he necessarily wants Ukraine to lose the war, but he does seem unduly sympathetic to and deferential to the Russian view, which is honestly not terribly different from his own view in our hemisphere, which is that big countries should be able to dominate their region. And if that means taking territory in their security interest, well, so be it. And I think his theory of the case for resolving this war from day one, which is in great contrast to the Biden administration and the European theory of the case for ending the war, has been essentially to give Russia what it wanted. I mean, to the point again, he cut off providing US weapons to Ukraine. He embraced Russia's narrative about the war. And on multiple occasions, he's been willing to apparently make the territorial concessions that Putin wants. He doesn't seem to, again, unlike the previous administration, which saw this not only through the prism of Ukraine and its sovereignty and the people of Ukraine, but a broader prism about rules and norms and territorial integrity and whether you should be allowed to change borders by force. Trump doesn't seem to care about that at all. So again, I don't know that he wants Ukraine to lose the war, but he doesn't care a lot about defending those things that Ukraine is fighting for.
Evren, let me turn to you. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine came at a really interesting moment for Turkey. It came as Ankara was trying to repair ties with Western allies without getting the kind of warmth it was hoping for. The war changed that, reminding the West how much it needs Turkey, and Trump's return has only strengthened Ankara's hand. Now Erdogan and Trump are saying they are trying to clear out the long-standing issues between them, and chief among them is Turkey's defense ties with Russia. And that brings up the S-400 question. We keep hearing from both Turkish and American officials that a solution is close. So my question is, what is the most face-saving way for Erdogan to resolve this, and one that Washington can also live with? That's my first question to you.
Yeah, I think we have been hearing a lot about the possible solutions to the S-400s issue. This came up right after Trump-Erdogan meeting as well. There was a huge discussion in Turkey how the issue could be resolved. But I remember, and it was like a month ago, I guess, if I remember correctly, in December, mid-December, defense minister said that there are no developments in terms of the resolution of the S-400s issue. But then Hakan Fidan was basically mentioning, okay, we are going to find a way to basically renew find a solution in order to get rid of the two penalties that Turkey had, removal from the F-35 program and KETSA sanctions, which are both very important for Turkey's defense industry. So, and what the solution, as you were asking, what Turkey can do, I think there are three solutions. The first solution is keep the equilibrium as it is, or whatever the way as it is. Store it and do not activate it. This is the official Turkish position right now. But if you do that, F-35 issue still will not be solved, and sanctions in terms of gas sanctions will continue. I mean, it's not going to resolve on its own, even though Turkey solves the S-400s issue, but it's a really important obstacle to solve these issues. So the first option is do nothing, right? Keep the condition or the situation as it is, which seems to be not an option anymore. The second issue is that removal of S-400s, and how you do that. you can return it to the Russia, and Turkey tried to, or at least there was some official comments on we're gonna return the S-400s to Russia. But from the Russian side, there was a disclaimer. They said that this issue never came up. So that's one option, returning it. The second option is restating it. But Russia restricts re-exports, so there you need the Russian approval, which Russia is also not willing to give. And also US really wants to control where it's going to be redeployed. So you need to find a safe third country. And it is also very difficult because Moscow doesn't really want Turkey to escape the bit. Really, it puts Turkey in a very tight situation, finding a solution to the S-400 issue, and you got stuck. And the third option is basically dispose. And disposing is basically storing it under in certain area with removing key components with a third party monitoring or something like that. A deal between US and Turkey, or with a credible monitoring, of course. Maybe NATO monitoring, maybe US monitoring, something like that, which Russia also refuses. So these two options are basically, the second option is basically on the agenda right now, but there is a third option Turkey is also considering, which is like accept the deadlock and move on and try to find different alternatives. This was basically the official approach last year, 2024, before the Trump's election, which was like, let's just upgrade F-16 fleet, let's or buy Eurofighter jets, or accelerate Khan and this and that, which seems again very difficult for Turkey. I think there are talks going on. Turkey is trying to persuade Putin to find a solution to that, using this personal relationship between Putin and Erdogan. But sometimes we hear that the solution is close. But I don't think the solution is not yet close.
Phil, I want to put this to you as well, since you were recently in Turkey, and I believe you spoke with people there. But Evren laid out several options that are being discussed, and I think the status quo, which is doing nothing, is not something Erdogan wants. Maybe with the Biden administration, he was quietly settling down for that. But I think with this administration, he sees an opening because they seem to think Trump can make things happen. And it's on some level he can. With the CAATSA sanctions, I think that grants a little more room to maneuver for the US president, but that's only going to be temporary, which is going to be problem for Turkey's request to get back into the F-35 program. And second, the reason why the status quo is not something that Erdogan wants, the defense sector has become really the key to his survival, domestic survival. And the sanctions create a lot of problems. It's not but just buying the F-35s or getting back into the program, but even with Turkey's own indigenous jets, Turkey needs certain critical parts, including engines. And Foreign Minister himself said this after the White House visit, saying that if these sanctions are not removed, we won't be able to complete the Khan Turkish indigenous fighter jet. So that's why they are desperate to find a solution to this. But what is a solution that works for both Ankara and the Congress, not just Trump, but because it's a piece of legislation. So what is your take on that, Phil?
Yeah, so a couple of things. There was a good laydown by Evren of the options. I do think it's right, as you both sort of suggested, that the status quo is starting to be worse than the alternatives to it. I mean, we've all been banging our head against this problem for a long time, and there just wasn't a path out because the cost to Ankara for US wasn't going to budge. I mean, once we decided that this was not compatible with F-35 and legislation, it just is. And I don't see any flexibility on the US side, and it's a bipartisan thing. So given that, then it's just up to Turkey. Is the status quo worth sticking with? it had been because the costs of the alternative, the status quo, are high. I mean, losing face, wasting a system that was expensive. But I think this has been a ball and chain for Turkey, ever since Turkey bought it, which was done, partly to stick it to the Obama administration for allegedly not being willing to provide air defenses, even though, having worked on it at the time, I don't think that was the case, and a way to have good relations with Russia, which Turkey needed in Syria. But the result of it was, we're in a sort of worst of all worlds. So you pay a lot of money for the system, but agree not even to use it, blocking the relationship with the United States. The costs of that by, as you suggested, not being able to take part in the F-35 program, which has shown its merits since, right? And we've seen now that this aircraft is online, Turkey sees what it can do, undermining Turkey's defense industry, which is a key part of the economy. And I think not least, and this is another reason there's movement on this, I think Erdogan sees a real opportunity with the Trump administration to develop the relationship that was so frozen under Biden for a whole range of reasons. I mean, Biden himself and the personal relationship, what was going on in Syria, what was going on in Gaza. And you put all that together, and now the benefits of finding a solution seem to outweigh the benefits of just like sticking with the status quo. So going back to so if that's right, that it's like now time to deal with it, going back to the options everyone laid out, I think just sticking with the status quo isn't a realistic option. I would love to see it, be transferred for use in Ukraine, but that's not realistic either. Russia would never agree to it. And Erdogan still wants to maintain his relationship with Russia. So I think the most likely way forward is some sort of transfer back to Russia, maybe with a face-saving, financial. Russia's not going to pay full price for a system that it sold, but maybe, it gives discounted oil or something so that Turkey can say it wasn't a complete waste. And Russia gets something out of it too. They can actually use the system themselves. But I do think that after, whatever it's been, a decade of no way forward, that the stars have aligned such that we might actually see a way to solve this. But I put a big emphasis on that piece with the United States. This is also an obstacle to the relationship with the United States that has been frozen that has been in a really bad place for other reasons for quite some time. And Erdogan sees an opportunity to change that. And this is a necessary precondition for that.
Phil, now that I have you on the record, one of the talking points from Erdogan's the pro-Erdogan camp was that, we bought the S-400s because Americans were unwilling to sell us the Patriots. Mm-hmm. Was that really the case?
No. If you remember when Turkey, the context of this, of course, was Turkey worried about Syria and missiles potentially coming in from Syria, which, to be honest, we thought every country needs to take any missile threat seriously, but we thought Turkey was overstating the degree to which there was a threat. And yet, because Turkey was a close NATO ally and we wanted to work with it, found a way. It's not as if the United States had then or has now Patriot systems laying all over the place for quick deployment to other contingents. They have to come from somewhere. And nonetheless, we worked it out with NATO allies, if I remember the Germans and the Dutch, to rotate Patriot deployments because our ally Turkey told us it had an air defense threat and we wanted to deal with that. And we dealt with it in a satisfactory manner. And then once the threat was really reduced and felt under control and there were priorities elsewhere, I think it was time for that rotation to end. And then the United States was in talks with Turkey on the terms for Patriot sales, which we were more than ready to do. But then there were ultimately disagreements on, tech transfer prices, not just the system, but the entire configuration. And Turkey felt that we weren't giving favorable enough arrangements for this sale, which we were absolutely willing to make, and decided to show us that it had alternatives. And that's at least my sense or recollection of how we got here. But the result of it was, this terrible situation for Turkey, which then had a system that it couldn't use. So that's all now hopefully water under the bridge, with an opportunity to get back to working together as close allies and partners, including on air defense and other defense cooperation.
And it's a major national security weakness for Turkey too, because of that decision now. If Turkey cannot purchase fifth generation jets and is unable to produce its own, and when you talk to defense officials who are non-partisan, they say that the most likely scenario is Turkey will be able to build Khan by 2035. So that means from now until 2035, Turkey may not even have the F-16s, and it won't have the fifth generation jets where Greece has and others in the region. So it's a huge national security vulnerability. So that purchasing the S-400 was a very risky, very unwise decision. Andrew, Phil and Evren talked about this option that Turkey may send the S-400s back to Russia. And there were even reports that Erdogan even raised this directly with Putin. How do you think Putin would react to a move like that?
I think that the core Russian goal here is to plant wedges between the United States and our NATO allies. And the balancing act for U.S. policy should be to try to minimize the opportunities for Russia to be able to benefit from those kinds of sources of dissension and mistrust. Unfortunately, take any number of issues: Ukraine, Article 5 commitment to NATO, Greenland, the dispute with Turkey over the S-400s, and the Russians are just sitting back and enjoying watching these problems fester and multiply. So I don't think it's really about the ability of Russia to be a constructive player in any face-saving accommodation. It's really about Russia's desire to capitalize on the problems that have sort of sprouted up in our relationships with NATO allies. And those didn't start with Donald Trump, but certainly they're multiplying.
Evren, there's a question from Emre Günaydın about Turkey. He asks, how does Turkish use of Russian LNG and other petroleum products factor into their relationship? And is this enough of a pressure point that Putin can utilize to reduce Turkey's ability to balance between the West and Russia?
Okay. So, we have been talking about this energy as one of the main reasons that you see Turkey has this pragmatic relationship with Russia. Even when there's this war going on, that Turkey tries to be getting closer to the NATO and allies and the European security. It really is the main lever that Russia has on Turkey. Turkey still buys large volumes of Russian gas. And in December, I guess, again, last month, Ankara extended gas contracts for 1 more year. And it's still going on. Significant part of the Turkish energy is coming from Russia. But you also see a lot of diversification efforts. This is something we talked as well. Energy diversification in Turkey. What we see again, Turkey is basically having long-term LNG planning with the US, including regasification capacity. I remember again, if I remember correctly, BOTAŞ signed a 20-year LNG supply deal with the US firms starting this year. What Turkey is trying to do, keep Russian gas as a base load while building a US-linked alternative and other alternatives as well. I think there is, but also the nuclear, which we also need to underline. Turkey and Russia has this nuclear tie as well. I think that's pretty much it.
Andrew, I think this is a question for you. Agree on Russia's inability to rebuild ships, but would Turkey allow Russia to simply move other ships into the Black Sea?
I think that's probably more for Phil or Evren about Turkey's view of the Montreux Convention and whether it's willing to relax its, very long-standing position about Russia's access to the Bosphorus.
Evren or Phil, you want to weigh in on that question?
Um, Yeah, I think it's the baseline is still the mantra. It's the Turkey has treated the Straits regime as the main stabilizer since 2022. But what changed is the spillover effect. And specifically, this is also something we discussed when the Ukrainian drones hit Russia-linked tankers inside Turkey's exclusive economic zone, again, last December and November. So after those incidents, Turkey has been put on alarm because those were commercial ships and this is exclusive economic zone. And Turkey is also building a literal security force with Romania and Bulgaria. And this is a mine countermeasures task force, I guess, which deals with drifting mines, maritime safety threats, specifically for commercial ships. I think it's a regional security management. So Turkey is really increasing its regional security management by the Black Sea states. This is what I called a revised regional ownership of the Black Sea. And this goes in line with your comment that Hakan Fidan is, and the question that you asked me, Hakan Fidan is basically stating the fact that Turkey is willing to have this naval force or to lead the naval force in the Black Sea.
There's a question from Steve Flanagan. He says Turkish naval forces have grown significantly in recent years with more than 15 new vessels planned for completion by the end of the decade and have made impressive progress in the production of unmanned surface and underwater vehicles. So Turkey has the military capacity to play a larger role in Black Sea security, particularly in the western sector, and to help ensure Ukraine's freedom of navigation under a post-war settlement if backed by its allies. And he would like your take on this.
Who's your good? Well, I defer to Andrew. Steve knows more about that issue than I do, so I defer to Evren and Andrew.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, this is in line with what I was saying, basically, what you were saying and what I've been saying. Yeah.
Andrew, you have
No.
anything to add?
Yeah, not my lane. As Phil said, Steve's the expert here, and hi, Steve.
Good comment. Thanks for that.
Last question here. If, let's say, and anyone can answer this, let's say things move forward with the Ukraine peace deal, Americans, Europeans, Ukrainians, they're all on the same page, and Turkey becomes part of this, either the Black Sea mission or maybe it's part of this multinational force to be deployed in Ukraine. Let's assume that for a moment. What are some of the ways that Putin can respond? Again, I mean, going back to these recent drone incidents, right? So I'm assuming that Putin still values a partnership with Turkey, especially now that he's isolated. So it won't be outright conflict. It has to be a gray zone response. So Andrew, what in your opinion is what are some of the things that Putin can do that would hurt Turkey but would also keep the relationship?
So I would also, just again, as I did earlier, pull the camera back a bit, and any form of comprehensive settlement to end this war is going to be extremely complicated. It will have lots of moving parts and lots of sequencing issues. So you brought up earlier the notion of possible Ukrainian withdrawal from the parts of Donbass that it still controls. You can imagine a situation where Russia, instead of agreeing to this idea of a demilitarized zone, simply moves its forces, policemen, into the disputed area and moves right up to the new border. You could see disagreements about the timing for Ukrainian possible withdrawal and the timing and sequencing for a referendum, which is dictated by the Ukrainian constitution for any arrangement along these lines. Phil, I think, has many more scars than I do from the Minsk process that was in place after the first phase of the war in 2014. But, this is, a set of agreements that are being talked about that will be extremely complicated to monitor. There could be any number of provocations and false flags where Russia tries to nullify the Western commitment by claiming Ukraine has done things that violate the terms of the agreement. There was a lot of that kind of nonsense, very clumsily done at the beginning of the war in 2022. So, the Russians are mischief makers and will work, I think, very aggressively to undermine the credibility of what sort of security blanket the United States and Europe are trying to put around Ukraine. And that gets back to probably the most crucial, important element of this is what kind of security package are the United States and Europe prepared to put in place in terms of long-term support for Ukraine's military capabilities so that Ukraine is not left defenseless against a future wave of Russian aggression. And that would require, a kind of very long runway stretching out, years to come and tens of billions of dollars in security assistance that Ukraine is going to need to be able to defend itself, as well as Western military and other forms of intelligence cooperation that'll sort of make that military capability as lethal and effective as possible to deter Russia in the future.
Phil, you have anything to add to that?
I do, and not because I disagreed with it. I thought that was very well put. And I won't fight the premise of your question, which was assuming we have a peace deal and assuming Turkey is part of it, because I don't assume either of those things. But if I accept your framework and somehow at some point we do get this deal, I agree with Andrew. I think you can assume, not fear, but just assume that Russia will not be a good faith actor and will do all sorts of things to undermine it. Russia doesn't believe in a sovereign, democratic, functioning Ukraine, and even if it somehow does agree to some peace deal that we think respects that, Putin won't. And don't forget that not only has he invaded Ukraine, and this is, I think, overlooked. Russia has been behind, package bombs in Europe and drone attack incursions into NATO countries and assassination plots against defense industry officials and cyber attacks and infrastructure attacks. And I think you can assume that type of thing to go on to reinforce Putin's view that Ukraine really shouldn't exist and it certainly shouldn't be sovereign and independent. So I circle back to, and I think Andrew was saying something similar, for me, the bottom line needs to be as much support for a Ukraine that can defend itself as possible. Because I have very little confidence that any sort of US guarantee, we saw this even a week or two ago when Putin alleged that Ukraine tried to strike his residence and Trump accepted that at face value. We'll see all sorts of allegations that Ukraine violated this or that and Russian responses. So if we ever get to that happy day where we have a ceasefire and a security guarantee, it really needs to be reinforced by as much support to Ukraine so it can defend itself against what will certainly be Russian attempts to undermine and weaken it.
Sorry, I know I said this was the last, but there's one more question from the audience. The question is, with the recent escalation in the Black Sea, could a new Turkey UN-brokered Black Sea initiative grain corridor make sense? The original one had expired mid-2023. So any thoughts on that?
For me, everyone may have a view. Of course, it would make sense, and we would want to see it. Last time, the problem is you need both parties to agree to it for such an initiative to work. I think we were able to use some pressure last time on Russia, which also wanted to export both grain and fertilizer. So it could have an interest in doing that. But, it also broke down largely because of the Russians, and Ukraine had to find a workaround. So, of course, it would make sense, and we should try to make it part of any peace agreement, if possible.
It was getting more difficult even back 2 years ago. So, yeah, I agree to Phil.
Well, unfortunately, we have to end it there. Thank you so much, Evren, Phil, Andrew. This was a fascinating discussion. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Thanks, Gano.